We have a great panel. Laurence Dubuc and MacDonald from the University of Montreal, and from Rutgers, Sheri Davis, Janice and Phela Townsend. Why don't we go in that order, if that works for our panelists? Just briefly introduce yourselves, a little bit about your work, and then we'll certainly get more to it in the discussion, but just respond briefly to this idea of scholar activism, if you see your work fitting into that frame and what that means for you. Cassie, if I miss anything, please let me know. And otherwise, Laurence, I'll hand it over to you.
Merci, Alyssa. Je vais parler en français pour la rencontre d'aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup d'avoir organisé cette session. Ça me fait vraiment plaisir d'y participer et d'y participer avec tous les collègues qui parleront aujourd'hui. Donc, je m'appelle Laurence.
My name is Laurence Dubuc. I define myself as a woman, a friend, a daughter, a partner.
Accessoirement, une personne qui est couramment en train de terminer un doctorat à l'École de relations industrielles à l'UDM. Je dirais que je m'identifie aussi à ce que Sarah Ahmed définirait comme une feminist killjoy, au sens d'une personne qui s'engage à tenter d'aborder peut-être des questions, des vérités qui sont inconfortables, mais qui m'apparaissent nécessaires dans le cadre d'un engagement plus large à promouvoir la justice sociale à l'université et en dehors de l'université. Je travaille depuis plusieurs années sur les communautés artistiques, les mondes de l'art, et je travaille donc avec des artistes et travailleurs culturels qui vivent une grande précarité et avec qui je me suis impliquée, dans le fond, particulièrement depuis le début de la pandémie, dans le cadre de différentes campagnes de mobilisation au provincial et au fédéral. Je pense qu'on on a probablement pour les participants à la table ronde d'aujourd'hui des définitions différentes de ce que ça veut dire l'activisme universitaire. Et je pense que c'est vraiment important d'accueillir cette variation-là dans les définitions puis dans les manières de l'envisager et de le faire. Parce que c'est important de se doter, je pense, de regards qui sont différents, qui sont multiples, sur ce que ça veut dire de mener une recherche qui est plus militante ou qui est plus engagée. Pour moi, la dimension activiste de mon travail, elle se trouve davantage dans la manière, peut-être les manières de la réaliser, au sens d'employer des épistémologies, des méthodologies plus collaboratives, puis vraiment de m'immerger dans les communautés que j'étudie, mais aussi dans la manière de partager ma recherche, c'est-à-dire peut-être en mobilisant des canaux qui rejoignent davantage les acteurs de la société civile et non juste des journaux académiques de pointe, dans la mesure où...
to the extent that it's important for me that we work for the service of the communities where I work and where for a general development, social development. And to answer the question which was asked by Alyssa, what I'm expecting that the university academic should has to take an ethical position. Research has to be based on very strong ethical foundations. And we have a place. Our place is fundamental. Most of us
comme un bien public, mais je trouve qu'on se questionne quand même peu sur la manière dont le monde académique nous amène à reproduire des connaissances d'une certaine manière, puis la manière dont ces connaissances-là finissent par être diffusées dans des réseaux qui sont finalement assez petits, des réseaux très de pointe, puis qui finalement servent peut-être plus ou moins les communautés qu'elles concernent directement. Et ça, je pense que c'est une conséquence directe du virage néolibéral de l'institution académique. On pourra certainement en reparler avec les autres collègues. Certainement, cette démarche-là, pour moi, s'est imposée graduellement, mais aussi naturellement, je dirais, parce que c'est ce qui correspond davantage à mes valeurs. Je me suis sentie et je continue de me sentir relativement mal à l'aise à plusieurs moments dans l'institution académique vis-à-vis de ce que Dr Tamara Lee a mentionné dans une table ronde organisée pour la CRI, le performative powerlessness, le fait de performer, le fait qu'on n'a aucun pouvoir sur le cours de l'action dans l'institution universitaire. Pour moi, le fait de m'engager dans une recherche plus militante, ça m'a permis un peu de me réconcilier dans une certaine mesure avec le métier de chercheur au sens où j'ai l'impression maintenant de pouvoir vraiment m'engager dans une recherche que moi, j'estime socialement utile. Puis, cette démarche-là, elle ne relève vraiment pas de processus bien établi, mais plutôt ce que je dirais d'expérimentation collective, puis de travail ancré dans les communautés, essayer de disséminer de manière alternative les résultats de recherche, d'essayer de publier dans des ouvrages ou des journaux qui ne sont pas nécessairement académiques, mais qui sont réellement utilisés par les communautés que j'étudie, me rendre aussi disponible pour avoir des conversations. Le seul critère pour moi qui guide ces processus, c'est vraiment de m'engager dans ces démarches-là avec soin ou avec care. Dans mon travail académique, je m'intéresse de plus en plus à l'éthique féministe du soin, comme cadre théorique, comme cadre analytique, mais c'est important pour moi de m'assurer de la mettre en application dans ma vie en général, puis dans mes relations avec les autres.
Thank you so much, Laurence. Ian, do you want to go next?
Yeah, well, thank you to all the organizers for putting this panel together and for inviting me. I'm really excited to hear what everyone has to say, and I share a lot of what you said, Laurence, especially Laurence, especially the importance of not just reproducing ourselves as academics and disseminating our work as widely as possible. I've always thought of my research as being concerned with questions that the labor movement is confronting, or with questions that I think should be discussed in a labor movement. So I think of my work in political as much as intellectual or academic terms. I think of my writing, frankly, as a political intervention that's guided by my commitments as a socialist. And I consider myself very lucky to find myself in a field where that kind of writing might be considered a valuable academic contribution. I'm not an activist, and I say that out of respect for the activists I know. I don't share their skill sets, and I haven't made the sacrifices that they've made. On a good day, I might consider myself a scholar. Otherwise, I'm just an academic who aspires to be a scholar activist. I have engaged in scholarly activism over the past few years. Notably, I work with a group of precarious workers who put together a non-union association that eventually became a union. So I assume that's why I'm here today on this panel. And I've had a lot of opportunity to think about that experience and why that was important for me, and what the challenges were that I dealt with. And I should say that out of that experience, scholarly activism means for me collaborating with activists as academics. In other words, we keep our separate identities and roles. And as Laurence said, we surely have different ways of thinking about what scholarly activism for me what it means, but for me it really means collaboration in a way that keeps these roles distinct, and that's important, I think, because we don't share the same risks. Even if we're precariously employed academics or junior faculty, our livelihoods are not on the line, and I think those who bear the risks of social action, and there are risks, ought to be making the decisions. So I think when we engage in scholarly activism, there has to be discussion about our roles, and they should be clearly defined. And in my case, that was offering advice, producing concrete research outputs, training in research methods, and also lending our social legitimacy for what it's worth to activist projects. But even if we just offer advice, that's an intervention, and we should be conscious of that fact and careful not to overstep. At the same time, as academics, we have to step back and we have to publish. And that's another discussion, I think, that we have to have with people we're working with. There might be reasons why they might not want us to publish right away, or they might want to have a say on how the findings are presented, or how the knowledge will be produced, and that's quite legitimate. In my case, I have considered it important to retain autonomy as a scholar, but I think that might differ according to different situations. So if I were to summarize, I would say that doing activist scholarship is a balancing act. It requires negotiations up front, and there might be trade-offs to be made between access and autonomy.
Thanks so much, Ian. Next we'll have Sheri, and then we'll have Phela, and finally Janice.
Hi, everyone. This is really nice. It's been a long time since I've been able to be in a space like this. So I appreciate whoever nominated me or suggested me for this, and love to do it in the future as well. So I think the first thing that I have to start by saying is that I identify as a critical race feminist. I think that's important because scholar activism is specifically outlined, written about, and discussed in critical race feminism. The roots coming out of Black feminist ideology as well as critical race theory. That means that because I identify as a critical race feminist, that interdisciplinarity is valued, so that I don't necessarily deal only in one discipline or another. I usually try to work with multiple disciplines to answer a particular question. And so there's a methodology that I ascribe to, which is really praxis, meaning, that it's not just about theory making, it's not just about taking action, but it's important to reflect. And it's also important to be engaging with people all along this, this process, and that the people in the room when you're doing the theory making are going to dictate the kinds of actions that you have and quite possibly limit the effectiveness. I would say I'm a bit different from Ian, just in terms of like the way that I identify as a scholar activist is that I've always been on a hyphen. I've never done work in academia when I didn't have my foot out working with movements, organizations, organizing, whether it was on campus or off campus, whether I was a grad student or a staff or and now faculty. And so when I think specifically about praxis, I'm well aware that when I come into any workspace in particular, that I have a project. I think it's important to state that as a Black woman, most of the time, the institutions that I'm in were not built for me. And so I'm already like my presence is already a bit radical. And in order for me to be grounded in that environment, I actually have to be able to stay connected to my communities so that I don't get lost in the values and the ideas of success that, again, were not built for me. I did attend Spelman College, which was one of the few places that was built for me. And that's where I actually learned about Black feminist ideology to begin with. And so it has been my process and my practice to be a scholar activist since my senior year in high school, actually second semester, senior year in college. I did start out in high school, but I didn't have language for it until I got to college. And I think that is another piece that's important. The other piece that I would say that when I talk about having a project, it means that when I come in, I'm interested in making and creating space for people who look like me in the discipline, reshaping the field so that it actually can accommodate the narratives, even the counter narratives that disrupt the field. I know that my job is to make sure that the space is more accessible for people who look like me and other marginalized folks, such that when I leave, that the place doesn't look like it did when I came. And beyond that, not just looks and representation, but it's also about perspectives. I know that I have to shift the paradigm. Again, if I'm going to be doing this work, it's not okay for me to say in my day job, I don't do anything, but on the weekends, I go and protest and make some stuff happen. As far as I'm concerned, I have to be focused on engaged learning everywhere. I have to be a whole person everywhere. And so when I think about scholar activism, to me, it's because I don't necessarily believe in objectivity. I think people study the things that they care about. So even even if you put together what you believe is an objective methodology, 9 times out of 10 is informed by your biases. And so I'd rather have a conversation about the bias up front. I would actually want to be able to say very clearly that I am not neutral, that I do want to think, do, and act. To take from some words of my colleague Janice Fine, it's not enough to just think and do, right? It is important. It's not just enough to think about these things. We actually have to do something, but then we need to be able to create space for others who are having similar experiences to inform the things that we think moving forward. Like it's a spiral. And if the spiral is working, we're working our way out. And so that means that the work we're doing inside the academy is also contributing to movement building. I identify as an insurgent professor, so I'm looking for students in every last one of my classes who are about that life. And if they are about it, I'm trying to figure out how to get them plugged in with the organization or the place that they need to be. I'm trying to talk to them so they understand how to engage with those organizations in a way that they're able to actively listen. I'm trying to disrupt some of the ways that they're often trained to not actually listen to the people and their lived experiences, so that if they too want to be scholar activists, that they have to respect the lived experiences and the expertise of community, working folks, their expertise in their own lives. And so for me, it's kind of like a constant all the time. I say I live life on the hyphen. I'm never just an academic. I'm never just an organizer. You know, I'm never just in one discipline. And so being comfortable, there are very few people I think who are comfortable being in the in-between. But I think being in the in-between is a necessary thing, because sometimes we have to hold these two threads together really tight until people figure out what the relationship is. But we have to respect, again, both sides, and bring that to all the spaces that we're in. So I think the last thing I want to say, just building off of what Ian said, partnerships are extremely important, but there are values that I think go along with it. They have to be mutually beneficial. There needs to be reciprocity. There needs to be opportunities for engaged learning across these quote unquote silos. And again, as I said, you have to respect the lived experience of all the people that you're engaging, and bring that into the mix. So I'll hand it off to Phela.
Hi, everyone. I know many folks here, if not all, but nice to see y'all. So thank you so much for asking me to participate on this. Those who know me know I love this topic because I'm constantly living in these in-between spaces that Sheri talked about and the other panelists. I also love, I've met Ian, I think once, but I love that I'm on this panel with women that have shaped how I think about myself, even how I will answer this question about what does it mean to be a scholar activist. So, you know, Laurence as a peer, we've done a lot of work in our critical race theory reading group that we've started, and just seeing a lot of the challenges that she has faced, you know, in her world, trying to bridge this has really helped me think about the bridges I'm trying to traverse. Sheri has been a mentor to me in a number of ways. You know, I'm just thinking about the comments, and I didn't know that Janice also has said this, but it makes sense thinking about Janice's work, but this idea of not just looking in to see, but looking in to see and do something about an issue very much, I think shapes how I approach my work. I will share, and this was actually the opening of my dissertation proposal defense that I did this spring. It was an opening slide, and I had these 3 quotes or ideas, and I began with them because I felt like they really shaped the choices and decisions that I made as I approached my work to this point that Sheri has also made. Well, all of the panelists, I think, have made in different ways about how we aren't just out here doing work objectively. We're always making decisions that are political. And so, you know, I'll just share with you these three points. So one is, you know, Nina Simone is one of my favorite artists, has said an artist's duty, as far as I'm concerned, is to reflect the times. I very much see my work in this space that we're in, of labor, as trying to be on the edge of the issues that workers are facing. It obviously has come up against tensions from academia. I've sometimes been told that I need to focus, or you know, in many ways, I'm dealing in spaces and on issues that those around me are, you know, that are more senior are not yet dealing with. And so that comes with its challenges. And I do think that this is in some ways about being an artist. And part of why I say that is because and this goes to, I think, again, Sheri's point about being, and I talk about it as inter and multidisciplinary. It's one thing to draw on different fields and spheres of thought and practice. It's another thing to sort of try to integrate, right? To create new ideas from them. And so to me, that's a creative process, right? That is, to me, what being an artist is. The second idea is a social scientist's responsibility, right, is to make sense of the world, right? That's very much what I think all of us here see ourselves doing in our work in various ways. And then this last point that I touched on is about being a scholar activist. Now, I, as others have said, don't know that I fit cleanly into either of those. There's questions about whether, you know, what it means to be a scholar, whether I'm actually doing that. I read a lot of stuff and then I try to take it into the work that I'm doing. You know, from an activist standpoint, I think to Ian's point, you know, I think it is important not to equate necessarily the work that I'm doing with folks that are living in more of a paradigm, a lifestyle, a livelihood of activism. However, I also think it's important to acknowledge that doing the kind of work that we are doing from a position of activism, I think that is something important to really take and embrace and understand what that's about, which is what this panel is about. So in some ways, I do think I'm being an activist in how I'm approaching the work and the political orientations that I bring to it. And, you know, this definition is really, a scholar activist is about bridging academia and community. But this last part, I think, is really crucial. It's navigating the tension, right, of holding the academy accountable to community. And I think this word accountability is really crucial. I've talked about this with some of my peers here on the call, you know, this question of like, who are we accountable to in our work? And there are obviously tensions that come with it. Any of us who know about academia, about higher education, and who think about this space with a more critical eye, know that we could probably argue that this institution was not designed to, I don't want to question whether it was designed to do. Well, you know, I have my ideas, but let's say it's evolved to a place where we could probably say it's not about being accountable to communities, or maybe particular communities that we care about that are the most marginalized. And so, you know, there's this quote that I can't even remember exactly. Someone had it on their email signature that really resonated with me, but it was basically, the gist of it was like, you know, as academics, you know, as an academic, they said, I don't want to anymore talk about looking at an issue because I think it's interesting or because I'm curious about it. You know, what would it mean to look at an issue because we are accountable to a particular community to really look at this issue? And so that's a lot of the lens that I am bringing to my work, to my dissertation in particular, which looks at Black worker centers. And again, those who know the process, for me, it hasn't been an easy one. And in many ways, it's because I'm constantly holding all of these different tensions tensions around race. What does it mean to, as Sheri has commented, to be a Black woman stepping into a space? I'm studying Black worker centers, but I come into that work with a particular positionality. Some might argue a level of privilege, and there's a challenge with that, right? There's an agenda that is not just mine that I have to center. When people are very busy and not necessarily available, it makes it challenging for me. It makes the process longer. And I'll save some of these comments to when we get to the part about challenges, that what this means to actually do this work. But I'm learning how to be humble in the work. I'm learning how to step back from it, from like what I want and I need, but also at times focusing on that. Sheri has told me I have to take up more space, right? And so I share this because there's something to this point about praxis where, as someone who is trying to do research in a way that is accountable primarily to the community, sure, academia, at the end of the day, I need to get some people to sign off on my dissertation. I'm getting funding through academia. And I do want to advance theory and how we're thinking about theory, how we're approaching how we understand and get at theory. But at the end of the day, I would not be doing any of the research I've been doing. I wouldn't even be here in academia if I was not trying to take what it is that I'm learning and bring it out into the world in substantive, meaningful ways that actually have impact, that can be measured, and to do it sooner rather than later. So I'll stop there, and yeah, hoping to bring up more of these issues in the next part of this.
Thanks so much, Phela. And so finally we have Janice.
Well, I'll just start by saying what an amazing turnout for a conversation like this. It's really amazing and inspiring. And I'm so honored to be on a panel with Sheri and Phela and Ian and all the people who are trying to walk this walk and live this life. So I'll just say I was a working organizer for 25 years before I became an academic. So I guess like what's already been said, it sort of was in my DNA. I was an organizer before I was a scholar. There was never a question right there, but there is this way that, these things are warring in your head. They should be warring in your head, right? And so I want to talk a bit about those tensions. It started even when I went to grad school at MIT at the time. Everybody was saying unions are dead, and I would picture in my head like all these scholars were teaching varieties of capitalism. They were all teaching. They were really obsessed with the firm and the state, and it was like the civil society and the labor movement had just fallen out of the discussion in political science. And I would imagine when they would say unions were dead, which they said frequently, so it meant they didn't have to worry about them. They have to study them. They didn't have to think about them. I think about all the years I'd spent in the labor movement, and in my head, I would see this image of all my friends having their desks like literally sucked out from, away from them, like that they no longer existed. And it took me a while to figure out when I was being cursed out in like, in high political science language. I was called teleological, normative. And I struggled with, basic, the ways that economics frameworks were being placed in political science. There was all this kind of assumptions about people's preferences were taken as a given. And then the puzzle was, what do they do? How do they act, right? Rational choice economics, basically, instead of problematizing how people's preferences were being formed in the first place. I have to say that for me, industrial relations was a huge relief, because industrial relations had a normative project. As imperfect as it is, it was so much better than political science. I felt a huge rush of relief when I first discovered the industrial relations people at MIT. So I do, I want to say that. So I'll just say, coming out of organizing, research was always a really critical part of what I was involved in. And we talked about movement research. And I think in some ways that's really stayed with me, this idea of movement research. And I say, just in a nutshell, what does that mean? It means find a great, demanding, practical puzzle that will make a difference in the world. And so for me, that means that my work is always kind of on the meso level. That's where the most interesting puzzles reside for me, right? Not the highest theory, not the, the day-to-day action, but somewhere in the middle is where I think a lot of it goes on. But I do think there are tensions, and several of my colleagues have touched on them. I'll just say, here's how I think about them. It's one thing to want to work with organizations and support them, and want to write about them, including analysis, constructive criticism. And there are many challenges that flow from this. So it's one thing to work with organizations and do empirical studies for them. A lot of my work is that, right? I do a ton of studies on wage theft violations, and organizations are super appreciative when you can do a practical piece of research for them. But when you place the organizations themselves in the center of inquiry, that is a different thing. And that's where I think a lot of the tensions arise. So I'll just say a little bit about what I mean. What do you do about, do you give organizations the ability to review what you're saying? In my case, the answer is yes, always. And then the issue is, like, do they review them, or do you give them veto power, right? Like, what's the balance of wanting to be in dialogue and having organizations really consider what you have to say and considering what they have to say, deciding when you're not going to write something, giving up the opportunity to write something because it's just too risky. You're choosing the organization, your relationship with the organization, the work you're doing with the organization over publishing, or writing something that's incomplete. You're leaving some things out on purpose. And that some people are going to say, oh, well, she didn't really know about this, that, and the other thing. And part of you wants to show, I did know those things, but you're also choosing, I knew those things and I didn't say those things. I think in some ways, you're always in a situation where you're sort of a go-between. You have this incredible privilege being a scholar, right? Having that PhD, having a birth in academia where you get access that a lot of organizers and a lot of people, don't have access to, but it means that you're always sort of in this place of tension. So in my case, for example, I do a lot of work with state and local departments of labor. And there are always tensions between those organizations and worker centers, unions, community organizing groups. So it's like it's a place of power. You can make things happen, but it's a powerful role that's fraught with danger. Similarly, with funders, in the US, there's an enormous dependence on the part of the left and progressive organizations and worker centers and community organizing groups on foundation funding. I think it creates all kinds of challenges. But the issue is, right, you become the person that funders come to when they want to understand something. That's a place of privilege. And again, it is fraught with danger. And so trying to navigate that is something you're sort of on the precipice all the time. So I'll just end by saying a little bit about how I try to navigate these. Whatever I write, I share with the organizations. I get their feedback and their corrections before I submit them. When I go in and do interviews at an organization, often my experience is that organization has never written down its history, or it doesn't have oral histories. So I take everything, I promise from the minute I walk in that every interview I do, unless it's a confidential thing with members and they don't want what they say to be shared, I always share those with the organizations so that they have the record. I raise the issues I'm thinking about with the organizations, no matter how painful they are, and we dialogue about the work they're doing. I try always to do panels about organizations with the organizations, right? So not speaking on behalf of, but speaking with in conversation. And I'm careful about what I say to funders about organizations that they're funding. So those are just some overall remarks before we get into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice, and thank you to the rest of the panelists as well for a really insightful set of first remarks. In light of time, we are just gonna, if folks have questions, open it up. I will just note that the title for the event was Challenges, Opportunities, and Resources for Scholar Activists. And most of the folks on the call, I think I'll venture to say, are emerging scholars who've expressed interest in this idea and framework. And so maybe if we open up now for questions, our panelists can kind of think about their answers in this broader framework or context, identifying challenges, opportunities, and resources for emerging scholars interested in the framework of scholar activism. So it's 10:40. If people, so we want to leave the rest of the time open for discussion. If people have questions, you can either raise your virtual hands or stack in the chat, or your physical hands, so that might be a little bit more difficult. And yeah, so if anybody has a question, they are very welcome to raise their hands or throw it in the chat, and we will do our best to monitor both. I see Eva, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for your contributions. It's really, really interesting, and I think it's a really important topic to discuss. I was just wondering what your key challenges were in terms of, or key challenges were in terms of building solidarities between organizations and yourselves in what you're doing. So, yeah.
So if our panelists want to just either chime in and unmute, or yeah, if this could be as organic of a dialogue as possible, that would be great. Or if you feel more comfortable raising your hand.
I can jump in. I would say time. It takes a while to build rapport and trust. Well, I think that depends on maybe how you come to the situation, what relationships you may have had that are pre-existing or not. So I'll speak for my example. You know, I had a way into the organizations from someone who's in a position of leadership at a national level. But, you know, in doing my field research more at a local level, these people don't know me from anyone. And so for me, the biggest challenge in trying to execute my dissertation research is both my time, their time, absolutely, and also just the time it takes to build the kind of rapport to get, I think, access, right, that is going to be beneficial and enriching to both parties, by the way, right? I think that one of my biggest challenges, in addition to time, is that I come with a legacy, not of my own doing, because I'm just here, of extractive research, where researchers have come into spaces and asked to do work with organizations and not necessarily offered much in return or in a timely manner, or that's considered of value. We can talk at different levels about what that might look like. And so it takes time, and frankly, time I probably won't have to get certain kinds of access to be able to really sit in and embed in an environment. And some of the best advice I got from someone who I think Sheri and Janice obviously know, Stephen Pitts, was get over that. You're not going to have enough time to build the kind of trust that you actually would need. And so how do you design your research in a way that deals with that, right? And that still has the organization at the center, and that does justice to the work that you're trying to do. So I would say those two, the time piece, and we can flush out time in other like there's different aspects to time, but also this trust building piece, and what it means to do research that is not extractive. I mean, a lot of my time on this project, I've had to offer up as a participant action researcher, which also gets to a question of methodology, really, because I've had to center this question, what can I do for you, right? That's of meaning and value. A lot of us come into these organizations and we say we're going to do a report and they don't get it back for a month, year, right? Like, so anyway, I'll stop there and let others chime in, but those I think are two of the significant challenges that I think are linked.
Sheri, I see you're unmuted. I don't know if you want to respond, and then Ian.
Yeah, what I was going to say actually is that again, it's different in terms of how you're coming at it. I think role matters. One of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is building network and building relationships. But I also would say that having a long time of being present in a lot of different spaces matters. And so the best example I can give is earlier this week, I was doing a meeting with an emerging group, the Philadelphia Black Workers Center, as well as Labor for Black Lives in Philadelphia. I am currently the board chair of the National Black Workers Center, but also working to build this. There's an interest in doing some partnering. There's some problems with the politics. The Labor for Black Lives is much more conservative. The Black Workers Center is much more progressive. There's, like ready to make this leap. And it was like, no, actually, as the person who is not concretely in one place or another, what I'm going to say is there's some really conservative politics that we need to address, right? We need to have a very difficult conversation about what we've heard and seen before we can start having a conversation about where there's some alignment. Here's what I think we can do. We can have this conversation. We can lay out these kind of values. We can determine whether or not the project that you're working on and the project that we're working on have any connections. And if they do not, then maybe we come back together a little bit later. And so my positionality, while I work at Rutgers in the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization, right? Like while I lead on a program called Will and Power, right? The relationship that I have with the person at the National Black Workers Center, who's the executive director, is through Will and Power, right? The relationship that I have with the Philly Black Workers Center is because of my work that I've been doing with the National Black Workers Center. The relationship that I have with Labor for Black Lives is through a friend that I've known for 25 years who's been organizing forever, who works with the organization that I used to organize with, right? And so it's not necessarily a situation of what is the distance piece that I need to come closer on. It is who are the people who need to be in the room to have a certain conversation for the type of work that we want to get done for Philadelphia Black workers, whether they're in a union or whether they're workers or whether they're aspiring workers. And that to me is a very different strategic conversation than it is like a research conversation. And so the question is, what role do you feel like you take up? What are your interests? If it is more on the scholar end, then that's a different question. If it is more on the activist end, then that is a different question. And sometimes it might be moving between that or sitting squarely in the middle, but I do think that that's something that is not fixed.
Ian, do you want to wrap?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on Phela's comment about time in particular. I found that to be a challenge, and I think it's a reason why maybe more scholars don't engage in activist scholarship. I was involved in a project for over 18 months, which began 3 years ago, and I'm just now producing the first research output. And I'm very aware, many of you will be emerging, as you say, emerging scholars, PhD students. You might not have the luxury of spending that amount of time or doing slow research, even if the results, I think, are definitely worth it. I think the results are seen in better, frankly, scholarship, because in trying to change the world, we understand it better. But it is a risk that I think we have to be aware of. The other difficulty I'll say very quickly was when you're engaged in activist scholarship, you're trying to solve concrete problems. You're thinking very concretely about an issue and how to advance social change. And when you then go back to an academic space, which we have to do, you find that activists are not, or academics are not necessarily interested in that story about how you or how the people you collaborated with achieved social change. You have to then connect it with an academic research agenda. And if you haven't begun with the academic research agenda because you've been working on questions that activists think are important, you then have to step back and reconnect and connect it with what academics think is important. And that was the challenge that I faced. And I think, Janice, what you said about mid-level theory is very relevant there, because if we take it to the mid-level, maybe that's where we might better able connect what the knowledge that activists are producing and that we're producing with activists with the knowledge that is valued within the academy.
Thanks so much, Ian. Just in the interest of time, what I might have is just I saw Johnny had a question, Kai and Jake. Just let each one of you say your questions, and then we'll give each panelist a chance to respond to all or one of the questions, or whichever they'd like to respond to. So why don't, Johnny, if you still had a question, why don't you go ahead and articulate your question, and then Kai and Jake.
Thanks, Alyssa. It's really similar to the question that was already asked, but I've had such a difficult time, like for my master's thesis, just getting the organization to engage with me beyond the actual interviews at all. And this was a union that I used to work for, and they wouldn't even look over or give me feedback on a draft of the paper that I produced from it. So I guess any sort of strategies or tactics you all have used to try and develop that sort of engagement with organizations, it's just been really difficult in my experience.
Kai, why don't you just say your question, and then we'll give panel, and then Jake. And
Great. Thanks for everyone's contribution and to the coordination committee as well as work. In terms of the formative projects, that's more able to be expressed in industrial relations. I hear throughout the 5 panelists that we have, the issues of living in this in-betweenness, taking on different risks at different times, and the tensions. And then I think the panel today was really helpful to give us a sense of the different form of activism that can also take place that would reflect one's positionality and basically how you want to use your time and what you value. One thing that really resonated was on the question of success, and I think Sheri mentioned this, of working in or being a part of institutions that are not made for me. And I think I can speak for myself. I felt like this in the workplace, and I felt like this in many contexts. And now this gets down to the point of resources, and Phela, highlighted time, and then others also highlighted the issues of finances. And also at the end of the day, we're doing our PhDs. There is a bit of some pressure in a pipeline at the end, unfortunately, of producing PhDs who will, and so I find it's, for myself, it's harder and harder to actually exist in those in-between spaces, because it's a major trade-off, right? And then I see myself just going through my courses at the moment, and then doing my last one, preparing for comprehensives, or thinking about them. There is the type of activism and the normative project, sometimes it is being discussed or intellectualized, but it is very difficult to be acted upon. In terms of resources, what will help? Is it the issue of time, or is it that we can intellectualize that we have a normative project within IR, but we are actually not giving it the resources and the appropriate power that it needs for more PhDs to actually experiment and also find a home that reflect, or issues that actually reflects their values. I hope that maybe that was a bit convoluted, but essentially it's on what are the resources that's needed so that people can actually say this is the type of success and then the type of institution that is important to to them and not follow the meritocracy that's also part of academia.
Thanks, Kai. And I know it's coming up here. We have it's 10:53. If people have a few more minutes, we'll just let each panelist speak after. And so Justin, why don't you, Jake said he would reach out to a particular panelist. Justin, why don't you ask your question and then we'll give each panelist an opportunity to respond to these three questions.
Okay, I put mine in the chat if that's easier for the sake of time, but I can just kind of reiterate. So it sounds like the past 15 minutes we've discussed a lot. Sheri, you mentioned strategy, right? So I think it would be kind of interesting or helpful for us as researchers and activists or wannabe activists to know, like, have you ever, I don't want to say failed, but have you ever picked the wrong strategy for the wrong objective, like for activism when you should have been looking for research or vice versa, or just kind of like maybe explain the difficulties of or the process of how you pick the strategy or vice versa, where you would have done something completely differently. I think that would be kind of a good thought experiment for people trying to be in this field. Because I'm sure that probably has happened before, and I think it would be helpful for people to know, you know, how to learn from others' mistakes, because I learn from failure all the time.
Thanks, Justin. So those are all really great questions. So we have from Johnny sort of specific tactics in engaging with organizations you want to partner with or organizations you work with. From Kai, this idea alluded to in the title, resources, how to allocate resources according to the scholar activist agenda, and from Justin, sort of brilliant failures you've learned from. So we'll just give each panelist an opportunity to answer one or all of those questions, however you'd like. And we really appreciate people sticking on for a few more minutes just so we can hear a final word and some comments in response to these questions from our panelists. So why don't we go around in the order that we began, Laurence, if you want to kick us off, and then we can go on from there.
Certainement, je vais m'exprimer encore une fois en français. Donc, par rapport à la question de Johnny sur les défis peut-être ou les difficultés de rentrer en relation ou de garder contact ou de développer des collaborations peut-être plus pérennes avec des organisations, je pense qu'il y a définitivement des chercheurs sur la table ronde aujourd'hui qui ont plus d'expérience que moi et qui pourront peut-être adresser cette question-là plus en détail. Mais je pense quand même que pour moi, la question de savoir est-ce que la manière d'essayer de développer cette relation-là est la bonne ou la plus appropriée par rapport aux réalités de l'organisation. Par exemple, je pense que dans la question, Johnny disait j'ai eu de la difficulté même à arriver à ce que les organisations lisent un article que j'avais écrit à partir d'une recherche que j'avais faite avec eux. Bien, peut-être qu'une manière d'adresser cet enjeu-là serait de leur proposer une autre façon de communiquer les résultats dans la recherche ou ce qui a été écrit dans la recherche ou dans l'article, comme proposer une conversation, par exemple, un appel téléphonique, un appel Zoom, une rencontre.
A Zoom call, a conference call or something, and bring things up, flush things out, and make it a more personalized exchange.
À travers des courriels ou à travers même Zoom, c'est quand même assez impersonnel. Mais juste de penser à ça, de penser à que la relation est une relation entre des personnes qui ont des sentiments, des émotions, qui care à propos de certaines choses. Donc, peut-être voir la façon dont on essaie de engage, ce serait une idée. J'aurais plus de choses à dire peut-être sur la question de Kai, qui est une question que je trouve très intéressante. Je pense que même avant et ça touche à ce que Ian disait aussi précédemment, je pense que même avant de réfléchir à comment est-ce qu'on développe ces collaborations-là à l'intérieur de la recherche, il faut aussi réfléchir à est-ce qu'on évolue dans un milieu qui nous permet de s'épanouir dans ces formes de recherche-là? Est-ce qu'on est dans des milieux où il y a une place, il y a des ressources, il y a des opportunités pour nous de vraiment nous développer puis de développer un agenda de recherche qui correspondent, en fond, à ce qu'on a envie de faire. Et tout ça est bien sûr informé par la position qu'on occupe dans le monde, évidemment. Donc, je pense que pour moi, j'observe définitivement une espèce de résistance tacite, explicite, consciente, inconsciente à l'intérieur de l'université sur le plan de la transformation des pratiques, des politiques, des discours qui entourent justement ces questions-là, puis qui nous permettraient, qui sont des questions qui n'ont pas juste trait à la recherche, mais qui ont aussi trait à l'équité, à la justice à l'intérieur même de l'organisation. Et tu sais, en ce moment, il y a toutes sortes de tensions aussi dans la société. Il y a d'un côté un mouvement de décolonisation à l'intérieur.
Decolonization that we have to accomplish within the academe. If we talk about, if we have to look for maybe more.
Aux États-Unis, on sait, il y a vraiment une guerre contre la critical race theory. Donc, il y a toutes sortes de tensions comme ça. Mais à l'intérieur de l'université même, il y a une résistance à ça. Et je pense que c'est notre responsabilité. C'est notre responsabilité de nous intéresser à ça, puis de s'assurer qu'il n'y a pas une cooptation des mouvements de décolonisation à des fins de positionnement stratégique universitaire, à des fins de progression individuelle, de carrière. Et ça, c'est des enjeux collectifs qui ont totalement à voir avec le développement organisationnel de l'université. Ça demande des efforts, ça demande du temps, de l'énergie.
You have to look, take a critical view, which we have to share this with our studies, with our students, with the authors we exchange with. We have many more students. People have invisible handicaps, ADHD. We can't have a traditional traditional kind of theoretical approach.
Plein de choses que Sheri a dit précédemment. Enseigner avec soin, gérer un département avec soin, interagir avec ses collègues avec soin, tout ça, c'est des formes d'activisme. Donc, évidemment, il y a plein de formes d'activisme, mais ça en est une. Puis évidemment, on l'a mentionné, c'est pas tous les gens qui sont positionnés de la même manière dans le système universitaire. Il y a des gens qui courent évidemment plus de risques, on le sait, mais personne n'est dépossédé de toute forme d'agentivité. Quand on est rendu à ce stade-ci dans l'université, on a quand même accès à d'immenses
access to major levels of privilege, which we have within the university, and you have to find what's your relative position and how you can be an ally in terms of the constraints you face. If everybody chooses to have the same reflections, other than they're just playing the game or respecting the rules of the game, maybe the rules will change.
Thank you so much, Laurence. And I'm just going to interrupt the order I said before, just because I think we might lose interpretation. If our interpreters could hang on for another 10 minutes, that would be wonderful. But just because we didn't hear from Laurence or Janice in the first question, Janice, I don't know if you wouldn't mind going now, and then we'll go back to the order. Ian, Sheri, and Phela. Thanks so much.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think everybody's questions are
Ce sont des bonnes questions pertinentes et c'est des questions difficiles. La première chose que j'aimerais dire.
Almost every case I've ever done, the organization was reluctant at the beginning. And so actually, I do think that relationship is huge. And at least in my case, it helped that I had a lot of experience and I could offer training, research, support in various ways. And, you know, I was an organizer. So some organizers were really excited about the idea of having an organizer kind of shadow them and be able to discuss their choices with them because they found that really interesting. I had one organizer who wanted me to basically introduce them to all the literature on worker power and on industrial relations and labor history. And so that was a really good, kind of relationship. But I actually think the relationship is huge. I don't think you can shortcut it. I think it's really important to spend that time. And I think it's really important to build the foundation because later on, as tensions come up around what you're saying about the work or questions you're raising about strategy, you've got a basis on which to have the conversation. So I don't know, I think, and then the other thing is, lots of organizations will get mad, right? They'll get upset. They'll think they'll if you are kind of raising some questions or that kind of thing. So you have to be able to like kind of you have to be willing to risk that, right, in the relationship. So Johnny, your question, I think it was your question, right, about what do you do to, I think you got to like, don't assume that they're going to read the whole paper. So send them the 2 or 3 pages where you really need them to focus, right? Give them the essence, write them a summary, send them only their quotes, right? To make sure you got the quote right.
Envoie tout l'article. En fait, aller sortir au resto avec them. Donc, expliquer verbatim.
Anyway, it's that kind of stuff, right? That, organizers are always crazy busy, and you're not at the top of their priority list. And so it's like, how do you actually, how do you do that? I think, Justin, your question is great. I really wish we had time to go into it. There are a couple of things that I've, and actually, Ji-Yoon, your question in the chat about what do you do when you don't like the organization or you don't agree with the organization or whatever. And I do think that's when you fall back on your social science, right? Like, where you're sort of sharing what they're saying and you're trying to pull out the lessons of it. And always you can use your conclusion, you can use your analysis to kind of raise your disagreements with what people have said. I'll just point you to one article I wrote that was really, really hard and painful and led to a complete rift with an organization, with the laborers union. And that's called When the Rubber Hit the High Road. So if you want to see like kind of a car wreck in real time, read the piece. I'd love to talk to you about it. Thanks.
And do you want to say any final words or respond to any of those questions?
Was that addressed to me?
Yeah, sure. If you have any final.
I was still thinking about what Janice was saying. I'm overwhelmed by these questions and the quality of the comments. Since Janice shared her story, I have been also blacklisted by a union for writing things that they didn't like. And I don't think it was wrong of me to write what I wrote. And I don't write on that union anymore, obviously, because I've been cut off. I won't mention the union. Have I made mistakes? Someone asks this question. I don't think that I've engaged in research, traditional research, where it should have been activist research, but I've grown dissatisfied with traditional research because for all the reasons that people mentioned in this.
Pour toutes les raisons qu'on a déjà citées.
But Laurence and Sheri, I'm inspired by the optimism that have and the drive that you have to challenge the university and to decolonize knowledge, and so I'm very attracted to scholarly activism for that reason. If I've made mistakes in scholarly activism, I think it would be not reading up on the theory before getting into it. I jumped into it without really thinking carefully about what I was doing, and I don't think I made big mistakes, but that's me. Maybe others I worked with would disagree. I've been really impressed by the quality of the scholarship on participant action research, and I went back to even the 40s, like Kurt Lewin, who coined the term social action research. He's worth a read. So I would read up on theory, and it seems a lot of people have done that better than I have. So that's another mea culpa. I'm going to leave it there in the interest of time. Thanks.
And then Sheri and Phela, final comments or responses to any of those questions.
So one of the things that keeps coming back around to me is, again, you should know what your project is. Nobody goes to grad school and gets a PhD right? Like if there's not something that you're trying to intervene on, like you just don't, in my opinion, you don't do it. And if you are doing it without having some sense of what your project is, you're probably not going to be the best in terms of doing the work. I'm just going to be honest. If you're doing it for prestige, this isn't the right place. I don't think anybody on this call is. Most people don't do scholar activism if they're interested in it being about prestige. But I do think that being clear about, there's this idea of the life of the mind, right, in academia. But the thing is that the life of the mind only works when you're in a universal body, right? If you are in a particular kind of body, right, that you feel what it feels like to walk down the hallway and know that you're in that body and try to do that work in that way, but you don't know why you're there, you're not grounded, and you don't know who you're accountable to, right? Like I have never worked in a university and not been clear that I am accountable to a Black community that is either across the street or the one that I come from, that I have a particular project, and that is something that I keep with me. I'm very clear that I fit within a Black feminist lineage, right? So I can call the names of the folks who have done scholar activism when there wasn't a name for it. And I can draw upon the ways that they went about doing this work. I'm a blogging member with the CRIMT Feminist Collective, and our whole purpose was to be able to take the things that we were talking about in academia and make them accessible and available to people who really needed it, because oftentimes the Black feminism I had access to, you wouldn't know about if you didn't get to go to college. And there were too many people who needed that information who didn't get to go to college, right? And so I do think, again, this piece around like, having a sense of what your project is, who you've grabbed the baton from, and then also thinking about who you're passing the baton to is significant. And to speak to Justin's point about like strategy and experimentation and failure, the thing that I think is most important that people don't tend to do because it's hard is upfront when you're crafting your relationship to be honest about like, what are your expectations? How do you want to partner? What do you agree to? What are your values? Alone will tell you, y'all don't need the partner, right? Like you aren't the right person for this. And sometimes when I've been in those spaces and I'm like, I'm not the right person for this, but I do know somebody who is, then I'm gonna go get that person and I'm gonna try to pull that relationship together so that the right people can be doing the right work, right? So sometimes we need to get out of the feeling that we're the only ones. We are not. There are plenty of people out there who have the expertise, who have the knowledge, the background, the interest, all that stuff. And so trying to like morph ourselves to be the everybody to everything is the thing that I think academics do far too often. And that sometimes we need to be able to say, I'm not the expert on it all. I'm not the expert that you need, right? Like that quite frankly, you might be the expert who is in here, and we need to get behind you and give you what you need to be able to say the thing, do the thing that you need to be able to do, right? Like you're the person. But that right there requires a level of honesty, again, that people have to come into the relationship with. And you need to be grounded in who you are, why you're there, and who you're supposed to be doing this work for. So those are the immediate answers that I have, right, to some of the questions that I saw. And again, I really appreciate being able to hear from the panelists, because the thing that I think you're hearing is a spectrum, right? Like that it's not concretely like a fixed thing here or there, but it is different. Our positionality is different, and our projects are different. And so I'm not going to pretend like I'm going to come and give somebody some deep research, because that's not the area, that's not the part of the spectrum that I'm sitting in. But I will connect you with the person who will give you that thing, because I do have relationships, and I value the fact that I can hold relationships with people across the spectrum.
Thank you so much, Sheri. And Phela, if you want to close us out here, and then Cassie will.
Yeah, I'll just quickly respond to these, but dittoing, this is an awesome panel. I think the number of people, I don't know who's required to be here or not, but I think the number of people speaks volumes to this as an issue. But so one, I would say this point about
cette question
that we have to make, being clear on the project, to me, they all get to being able to navigate the tensions. Like to me, these all get to the point I was making at the beginning about how I identify as an activist. And it's because I didn't realize this until now. I'm not an activist necessarily in the like community organizing way. I sort of see myself as supporting those people, but I'm absolutely an activist in terms of my choice to do this work as an act of political resistance to academia. And it's because every day when you wake up and decide to do this kind of work, it's a political act because you are choosing often against what the norms and practices of academia allow for. And I think that's really important. So these issues around time connected to resources, you know, part of the limitations of time, right? A big part of them as someone doing a dissertation, the ability to do something qualitative, the choice to do something qualitative, the choice to embed is absolutely connected to money, right? Because you want to get out and you want to make a job, or do you have do you have enough resources to stay embedded?
En fait, pour rester dans le...
Came back from Los Angeles doing field research. And frankly, I came back when I did because I need to come back and figure out how to get more money. And a lot of it is because there was a lot of time spent where there were days where I didn't really talk to too many people. Why? Because people weren't really available. Or, you know, it's just the life, right? We're doing work with people and organizations. So things come up and it's COVID, right? And so I say this because one, I think Kai's point about the material conditions, but also structural, right, really means that we have to have structural fixes to this. And it means building community in such a way that we can actually not only help those of us in this space trying to navigate. I said to a few people when I was doing my work in LA, like, I feel like we need more of a community to talk about these issues and challenges, because it wasn't until I talked to certain people, you know, someone referenced challenges Janice has had. I didn't even talk to Janice at the time, but she's had challenges getting worker centers to like be able to make space and time for her. Others, you know, someone saying to me, this is par for the course, talking with Cassie about this, right? Like actually settled me into what the work is about. So part of this is me saying, I think we need to have more of these conversations.
Plus de conversations. Il faut clarifier
sources for more of us to engage in this kind of work, because we can't do it if it's just individual fixes. I think this point about like strategy mistakes, I think I'm always making mistakes in the work. So, but I will say that, like, if you're going to do this kind of work and research, and I really question, like, this may be far from saying, but like, or maybe not appropriate. Like, I really question, depending on the types of issues and challenges you're looking at, whether there really is a purely scholarly position that is where you're making the kind of impact you think. Like, I think given the nature of the issues we solve, we should probably be in a position of activism, whether we recognize it or not. And so for me, the question for a lot of us is, how do we lean more into that and embrace it more? And so I always make mistakes, but I think centering the group and the organization, or whatever the people are that you think, and you're not studying them, right? I think it's getting out of that mindset that you're working with them and really centering their needs, centering, you know, while my needs are important, like, I have to actually take myself out of it. And so I think we need to have more conversations like this, I would say. And I'm happy, I think, you know,
mais j'aime beaucoup notre groupe.
That is a space where these issues do come up. People bring them into the space. But part of it is because we're reading critical theorists who are scholar activists, many of them. And many of them are posing political resistance, not just to society, but to academia. So a lot of these things do come up. But I'll stop there because I know we're over time. But thank you.
Thanks so much. And I know a couple of panelists had to go, but I just want to say and reiterate from all of the committee, a huge thank you to everyone who participated on the panel for such a really inspiring and passionate discussion, a great conversation starter that I hope we can continue moving forward. I know that Phela's plugged the CRT reading group. I'll plug it again. Just from a personal perspective, it's been incredibly valuable to me to be a member of the PhD network through CRIMT, to have met so many inspiring researchers doing this kind of work. For me, who didn't have that on my, or didn't have as much of that on my committee panel, it's really opened my eyes to how I need to go about doing this kind of work, all the things I need to think about before I do. So thank you so much. I just did to finish up by thanking everyone for we had a huge number of responses to our request for volunteers for the next year's committee members. So I just want to say thank you very much on behalf of Alyssa, Evelyn, and myself, and Dan. We've had such a huge amount of fun organizing the events that we've organized for you, and to introduce Kaisen Young, Justin Vinton, Isabel Maltese, Eva Herman, Genevieve Richard, and Ji-Yoon Park, who will be taking over for next year's events. So I'm really excited to see what they're going to bring. And thank you everyone for showing up and really making the series of events we organized so exciting and engaging. So thanks.
Merci tout le monde.
Miss you all. Thanks, guys.
Puis dernier petit mot pour remercier aussi le comité sortant, donc Alissa qui a fait un travail extraordinaire, Cassandra, Evelyne, Daniel qui nous a quittés au début de l'automne pour se concentrer sur la thèse. Alors, je tenais quand même à souligner que j'avais eu un plaisir immense à travailler avec mes 4 compères. Et ce fut un immense plaisir que je renouvellerai avec les 6 nouveaux membres du comité qui prendront bientôt la relève. Donc, encore une fois, un grand merci et puis pour une séance absolument fabuleuse. Alors, merci à tous les membres du panel, une présidence hors pair de Alissa, et puis un grand merci à notre interprète Joseph qui a très gentiment accepté de poursuivre avec nous jusqu'à la fin. Alors, voilà. Donc, c'est à une prochaine et espérons qu'on en organisera d'autres de ce type-là. C'est une conversation qui est extrêmement importante et qui doit se poursuivre. Merci à tous.